Hi boys and girls, I'm back with Powerless. I'm on chapter 13, The Old Query. Remember that they aren't supposed to go there? And Molly's good idea is that they go there. So let's see what happens. The trip to the Old Quarry took longer than either of them wanted. Daniel had expected them to fly there, but it turned out that he was a lot heavier than Louisa, and since Molly wasn't super strong like Eric, she didn't want to risk dropping him along the way. And since Daniel had no wish to be dropped, they decided to bike there instead. By the time they arrived, the sun had already started to set. Daniel had only ever seen the south face of Mount Noble, and the difference was startling. On the south face, even at night, you could still see the signs of civilization. Hiking trails, the lights of far-off homes twinkling in the distance. But here the wilds of nature dominated everything. Tangled trees reached high into the sky, and the underbrush was thick and nearly impassable. Except for the quarry, there were no signs of human touch at all. It was obvious to Daniel that for many, many years the North Face had been off limits to not just the supers, but to everyone. It doesn't look like anybody's been here since the quarry closed, he said. No, I doubt that anyone has. The North Face has always been an unlucky place. The quarry closed back in the 50s after a bunch of bad stuff happened there. Some kind of accident or something. The Shawnee tribe had a strange name for this place. They called it the Witchfire Mountain. Daniel stared at Molly. Who are you and what have you done with the real Molly Lee? She gave him an indignant look. What? Just because you're the detective doesn't mean that I don't know how to use the internet too? I did some research, that's all. Daniel thought back to the first and only time that he had seen a picture of Jonathan Noble, not the comic book character that he had inspired, but the real man. Molly, I saw an old photograph of Jonathan Noble standing with a bunch of children, and there was something about a fire. The St. Albans fire, she said. Sure, it's in all the local history books. It's what made Jonathan Noble so famous. Before that, he was just an ordinary fur trader. Daniel remembered the look on those kids' faces. They were scared and tired. Even Noble himself was a mess, covered in dirt and soot. He hadn't looked much like a hero then. He looked like a man who had just been through something terrible. What happened? St. Albans was some kind of orphanage connected to a monastery up here. In the 1930s, the monastery burned down. Everyone was killed, except for the orphans themselves. Jonathan Noble was passing by when he saw the fire, and he risked his own life to save them. He rescued every single child. Daniel looked around at the menacing trees and the deep, black gorge of the quarry, just a few feet away. Let me guess, he said. St. Albans was never rebuilt, and years later, yep, a mining company came in and dug a limestone quarry in the very same spot. The quarry suffered accident after accident, and eventually it was abandoned. Daniel felt a small chill go up in his spine at the thought of all that misery occurring in a single lonely place on the dark side of this very mountain. And here we are, he said. Molly tossed him a backpack, then flipped on a flashlight and revealed a trail that wound off into the trees and disappeared into a giant pit, the size of a small valley dug out of the side of the mountain itself. Here we are, she agreed, and with that she started down. The path was dark and treacherous, carved out of the quarry walls. At one time it had been a winding road, wide enough to allow the workers, trucks, and other machinery down to the quarry floor. But time and the elements had eroded much of the gravel and dirt away, and today the road was barely a footpath. At points, it was hardly wide enough for a single person to squeeze by. There were a few stumbles along the way, and at one point, Daniel thought he saw something move along the path ahead of them. He and Molly stayed frozen for about 5 minutes, shining their lights up ahead and listening to the sound of their own heartbeats. When nothing else happened, Molly blamed Daniel's sighting on a coyote or a bobcat crossing the path, which didn't make Daniel feel a whole lot better. Cautiously, they resumed their descent. They reached the bottom without further incident, and Daniel was thankful when the sloping path leveled out onto firmer ground. These days, the old quarry was hardly recognizable as a quarry at all. Over 50 years, nature had gone a long way toward reclaiming what humankind had taken away. The deep chasm still remained, but grass, shrubs, and even a few small trees had taken root in a once barren earth. The treasure here had been limestone, and exposed veins of the solid rock were still visible in the walls of the place. Though they were hard to see in the fading daylight, there were plenty of corners and crannies down here that were hidden in blackness. Finding clues would be a task indeed. The two intrigued explorers surveyed the area. "This place looks creepy enough," said Molly as she shone her flashlight in broad circle around them. "Well, there has to be a reason why it's forbidden, but more importantly," added Daniel as he eyed the desolate landscape, "forbidden by who?" Molly didn't answer, but the look on her face told Daniel that she was wondering the same thing. "Come on," she said after a moment. "We didn't come here just to stand around worrying." "Careful of sinkholes," she warned. "There are bound to be some deep ones around here that might have filled with water over the years. I'm a great flyer, but I'm kind of a lousy swimmer. I wouldn't be much help if you fell in." Daniel followed Molly deeper into the quarry, careful to shine his light on the ground in front of them. "So what do you suppose we are looking for?" he asked. "I don't know, Daniel. Clues, I guess? You're the detective." Clues, Daniel thought. Right. In an overgrown quarry, 50 years old, no problem. They had been at it for about 10 minutes when something began to bother Daniel. The south end of the quarry, where they had come in, was wild and overgrown. Daniel was covered in scratches and cuts from the thorn bushes they had pushed through. But as they neared the north end, the underbrush cleared significantly. He found that he could walk without fear of stinging branches whipping him in the face. There weren't even any spider webs spanning the path ahead of them. "Molly, stop," Daniel whispered. "Something's wrong here. There aren't any thorn bushes or hanging vines or anything else. It's a clear trail." So who made the trail?" Molly's eyes grew wide as she understood Daniel's meaning, and for the first time since embarking on this fool's errand, Daniel allowed himself a little smile. Despite the danger, he couldn't deny that detective work was exciting stuff. He got down on his hands and knees and started searching the ground, examining the weeds and bushes on either side of the trail. "What are you doing?" Molly asked. "Shine your flashlight down here. I need more light." It didn't take Daniel very long to find out what he was looking for. A broken sticker bush twig. He took the twig gently between his fingers and held it up to the light, pointing to the break. "See? The wood's still green. That means the break is fresh. Someone's been through here recently." Molly looked at Daniel, impressed. Daniel shrugged. "I read a lot." Molly smiled at this. Then she shone her light along the path, first in the direction of where they came from, and then where they were headed. "Then how come there aren't any footprints?" she asked. "You can see ours clearly enough. You would think that whoever broke the twig would have left some too." She was right. Whoever had been using this path was careless enough to clear the vegetation out of his way, but not enough to leave footprints. "I don't know," said Daniel, feeling uneasy. "Maybe we'll find the answer at the end of the trail." They started again down the path, more cautiously this time, and walked for another few minutes before the path ended abruptly at a sinkhole, half filled with putrid water. The hole was about 5 feet across, too wide to step over, and even too wide to jump. Shining their lights, they could see the trail continue on the other side and wind its way half into the blackness. Molly pointed her flashlight at the foul-smelling water and made a face. Who builds a trail that leads straight into a scum-filled hole? It just didn't make any sense. You've got me, but we'll have to find a way around if we want to see the rest of the path leads. Daniel started testing out the ground on either side of the sinkhole, looking for a safe passage. He could hear Molly tapping her foot in frustration and impatience. "Oh, for Pete's sake," she said. Daniel almost let out a cry as she grabbed hold of his round of waist. "Molly, what? Just hold on." She lifted the two of them off the ground, and they flew up in an arc over the watery hole. As they landed on the other side with a thump, a thought occurred to Daniel. "Of course." "What?" asked Molly. "You just showed me the only way someone could travel up and down this path and not leave any footprints. I was dumb enough not to think of it earlier. They could fly." Molly thought on this for a moment, but she didn't look convinced. "Well, we know it's not Eric, and we know it can't be Michael. So if there's another flyer in Noble's Green, I guess it's about time I meet them." They walked the rest of the way down the path until they reached the far northern wall of the quarry. There, atop a small hill and under a short rock overhang, was the opening to a cave. A quick examination showed that the entrance was sturdy and wide enough for a full-grown person to walk through without having to duck. It looked as if the tunnel went back about 30 or so feet before stopping at a dead end. This time, Daniel went first. Molly, being a flyer, hated small spaces, so Daniel suggested she remain near the entrance. Daniel crept along the dark passageway as silently as he could. Unfortunately, the tunnel echoed with every disturbed pebble. Gritting his teeth against the sound of his own footsteps, Daniel reached the end. So far, the cave had been unremarkable. A natural leftover from the days when men bored into this earth for stone. But here at the end was something else. The tunnel didn't stop on its own, rather, someone had stopped it. A large disc of solid rock blocked the pathway like a manhole cover tilted on its side. Two great iron handles were bolted into its face, and the walls around it were scuffed and chipped, a clear indication that this thing had been moved repeatedly. But it would take someone with strength far beyond that of the strongest man to move it. Daniel had just begun to search the cave wall for some kind of hidden lever when he caught sight of his own breath in the glow of his flashlight. He realized that he had instinctively pulled his jacket closer. There was a new chill in the air. Daniel turned his head and saw Molly standing in the cave entrance, hugging her arms to her sides to keep warm. Just over her shoulder, silhouetted in the twilight, a black shape floated, a shape darker than the surrounding shadow, a shape that Daniel now had a name for: the Shroud. His mind screamed the name, but his voice was caught in his throat, choked off by his fear. For an instant, he couldn't move as he trapped in the memory of the night of Simon's window, the terror of falling. Molly called to him. "Hey, did you find anything? Hurry up, it's freezing out here." Daniel swallowed his fear and found his voice as the shroud reached for Molly. "Behind you!" Till that moment, Daniel hadn't known just how fast Molly was. Not really. He had witnessed her speed in races with Eric, but what he saw before was nothing compared to what he just saw now. Or more accurately, what he didn't see. It all happened so fast. The shroud reached out a ragged hand of shadow that barely brushed Molly's shoulder, and instinctively she was gone. She must have felt the cold of that touch because Molly turned into a flash, a girl-shaped blur that was at the cave entrance one second and standing next to Daniel, grabbing at his sleeve the next. "Oh my gosh!" Danielism. Molly's powers were so revved up that she even spoke at super speed. Daniel could barely make out her words. "The north face is forbidden. Danger waits there." The shroud's voice echoed through the cave like the rustle of deep dead leaves and snapping of dry wet twigs or bones. The shape that rose up to prevent their escape was larger than Daniel remembered, its billowing black cloak snuffing out the light of their flashlights, its bulk blocking their path. Wisps of darkness seemed to undulate around its body, and its green heart of fire pulsed in slow rhythm. Daniel had the dread suspicion that he and Molly had just discovered the author of the rules. The rules weren't meant to protect the children. They were meant to protect this thing, to keep its home safe. And the two of them had just been caught trespassing. Molly grabbed hold of Daniel's cast. He put his good hand in hers to calm her, but he realized she wasn't looking for reassurance. She was gently pulling him away. She was leading him slowly toward the entrance of the cave, toward the shroud. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "We're cornered, trapped. We need to get outside. Whatever you do, don't hesitate. Follow me as fast as you can. Then just keep running." Daniel stared at the shadow blocking their escape and wondered how they could possibly make it past. It nearly filled the cave, and it was getting closer. "I just hope it's solid," she said. "What? Why?" "So that I can do this." Molly let go of Daniel's arm and flew straight as an arrow toward the shroud. She slammed like a bullet into the chest of the thing. As it turned out, the shroud was quite solid because Daniel heard it gasp as the wind was knocked out of it. Its great swelling blackness crumbled around little Molly Lee as the two of them tumbled out of the cave's mouth and out of view. Despite Molly's instructions, Daniel didn't move right away. He was in shock. 1 minute, the shroud was blocking their path. The next, Molly was flying into the creature and disappearing down the hill. "Molly!" Daniel snapped to his senses and ran for the mouth of the cave. When he reached the outside, he saw Molly lying some 20 feet down the hill. She had landed in a bunch of tall grass, and though she was moving, she looked pretty dazed. Unfortunately, the shroud was still conscious as well. It had landed only a few feet from Molly and was standing, or more accurately, floating upright. Daniel glanced to his left and saw the path clear ahead of him. The way out of the quarry was unguarded, and Daniel had plenty of time now to make his escape, just as Molly had wanted. But that wasn't what Daniel wanted. There was no way that he was going to leave her here with that thing. It had stolen the powers and memories of countless children just for the crime of turning 13. Who knew what it might do to Molly now that she had invaded its lair? But what could an ordinary boy with a broken arm do against such a monster? Hey, ugly, up there, up here. It was not one of Daniel's best plans. But in the heat of the moment, sometimes there isn't time for thinking. Sometimes you just have to act. The shroud turned its head toward Daniel and seemed to be studying him, judging whether he was enough of a threat to warrant immediate attention. Daniel needed to get it away from Molly, so he decided to stack the odds in his favor with some good old-fashioned trash talking. "You know, I'm not one of your supers, so your little rules don't apply to me. I think I'll come around here all I want. Matter of fact, I might bring some other people too, like the local sheriff, maybe even the Department of Homeland Security." It was enough. The shroud hissed and reared back its faceless head before slinking across the ground and up the hill toward Daniel. Unfortunately, this was as far as Daniel's plan went. In just a moment, the shroud would have him, and Daniel had no weapons other than this flashlight. Remembering the encounter at Simon's window, Daniel decided to try a desperate trick. He waited until the shroud was just feet from him, then he flicked on his flashlight full in its eyes, or at least where its eyes should be, if he had them. Even this close up, Daniel could make out no more detail than before. It was as if someone had cut away a shroud of shadow and given it form, with only that sickly green heart to disturb the blackness. As before, the flash of light seemed to make it hesitate. It slowed its attack and even pulled back, slightly. But Daniel's flashlight was still only a flashlight. On its second advance, it dove to the right quickly, avoiding the direct glare of the beam. In one fluid move, the shroud batted the light from Daniel's hands, and all he could do was watch as it clattered down the rocky slope. Daniel felt his breath catch in his chest as he watched long fingers of shadow creep out from the thing's hands, which were flexing and clawing eagerly at his sides. But to Daniel's surprise, it didn't turn those hands on him. Instead, it stayed still, and Daniel could feel the monster stare, even if he couldn't see its eyes. Such a smart boy, so smart and so brave for one so weak, so soft and so breakable. The shroud gestured to Daniel's broken arm. Again, its raspy voice grated along his nerves, making the hairs stand up on the back of its neck. Something in its pitch, its timbre, made even every impulse in him scream, run. But he held his ground. If he tried to flee, he had no doubt that it would overtake him. You're right, I'm not one of them. Daniel's own voice had lost its earlier bluster. Now he couldn't disguise the terror he was feeling. What are you, then? I'm just a boy. Ah, now there you are wrong. Daniel felt then a gust of wind, and the next thing he knew, he'd been knocked off his feet and yanked up into the air. Something had a hold of him, and that something was Molly. We're leaving, she yelled. Hold on tight. He wrapped his good arm around her waist and watched as the ground disappeared below them. Molly's face was red, and the veins in her temple bulged with the effort, but pure adrenaline was giving her the strength she needed now. For Daniel's part, he looked down at the disappearing ground and willed himself to think light thoughts. They had broken above the tree line, and Molly was just making the turn toward Noble's Green when Daniel saw the creature rising up through the trees. The shroud was giving chase, and it was gaining. Ordinarily, Daniel wouldn't have doubted that Molly could outfly it, but with his extra weight, they were losing ground. Molly felt it too. Without warning, she changed direction and flew up, straight up. Where are you going? Daniel shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. An old trick of Michael's. Hang on. And with that, she flew faster, aiming for the bank of the low clouds that had settled around the peak of Mount Noble. The shroud was only a few feet behind them when they entered the clouds. The night sky disappeared in the black mist, and Daniel felt the little pellets of rain sting his face as the air turned cold. They were twisting, turning, changing directions, but by now Daniel was too disoriented to know if it was on purpose or if Molly was simply, lost. They were flying blind, and Daniel even wondered if she knew which way was up. The shroud appeared out of nowhere. 1 second, they were alone in the dense mist. The next, the creature was blocking their path. Luckily, it seemed as startled as they were, and it hesitated for half a second. Half a second was all Molly needed to drop below its reach and disappear once more into the murky vapor. Daniel felt another lurching change of direction, and when they broke the cloud cover, they found themselves high in the sky, looking down at the storm bank. The cold wind up here was bitter and thin, and Daniel's ears and fingers began to sting with frost. There, Molly shouted, found one. Huh? Daniel managed between chattering teeth. A current, Molly said with a smile. Now we let the wind fly for us. Then they were driving, barreling through the sky and clouds, past trees and mountains. Daniel managed to squint behind them and see that they had escaped the shroud and Molly's desperate dive. Once more they flew alone while hurtling at a fantastic speed toward the lights and hard ground of Noble's Green. As they flew faster, still toward the ground, Daniel noticed that Molly was no longer smiling. Uh-oh, too fast, she muttered. He couldn't really hear her in the roar of the wind, but he could read her lips well enough because it was only also thinking as the ground rushed up to meet him. Uh-oh. See what happens next. The next chapter is called The Journey Home. That's it for chapter 13.